An original story, narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Lydia Colbourne's fingers trembled as they touched the midnight silk in Madame Delacroix's shop window. The same lion weave her father had imported 7 years ago, before the creditors came. Behind her, Lady Sybil Vane's laughter cut through the perfumed air like a blade, and the shop assistant's smile carried the particular cruelty reserved for women who enter places they can no longer afford. The door opened, rain-cold air sweeping through, and a man's voice, calm, absolute, and edged with something dangerous, declared that this lady would be attended first. And if anyone had difficulty with that, he would take his account elsewhere permanently. The child, clinging to his hand, looked up at Lydia with eyes that had seen too much grief for 8 years, and asked if the pretty lady could help her choose. In that moment, standing between the silk that represented everything she had lost, and the Duke whose intervention she had not asked for, Lydia Colbourne made a choice that would unravel every careful boundary she had built between survival and dignity, between gratitude and love. The rain had been falling since dawn, turning the cobblestones outside Madame Delacroix's shop to mirrors of gray sky. Lydia stood before the window, her cloak soaked through at the shoulders, watching the way candlelight caught the bolt of midnight silk displayed on ivory damask. She knew the weave without touching it. Lion silk, 40 threads per inch, imported through Dover and dyed with indigo, so pure it appeared black until the light struck it at an angle. Her father had ordered 3 bolts of this exact fabric in his final shipment. She had been 19. The cloth had arrived 6 weeks after the creditors seized the shop. She should not have entered. The door with its gold lettering belonged to a world that had expelled her family with the efficiency of a body, rejecting infection. But the silk had drawn her across the threshold, the way a former language draws the exile, and now she stood in the center of Madame Delacroix's establishment, with rain dripping from her hem onto Turkish carpet, her fingers resting on the fabric as though it were a gravestone. Does the girl require direction, or is she simply lost? The blonde tittered. Lydia felt heat rise in her throat. She withdrew her hand from the silk. I was leaving, she said quietly. A pity. Sybil smiled. The fabric suits you, though I imagine the price does not. The shop assistant, a thin woman whose name Lydia had never learned, appeared at her elbow with the particular smile reserved for people being escorted out. Miss, if you require directions. The door opened. A man entered, rain darkening the shoulders of his greatcoat. A child clung to his hand, her face pale and solemn beneath a blue bonnet. The man's gaze swept the room in 3 seconds, taking in Lydia's wet cloak, Sybil's raised eyebrow, the assistant's positioning, and the bolt of silk still gleaming on its stand. His expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness made every woman in the shop turn toward him. This lady, he said, his voice calm and absolute, will be attended first. The assistant froze. Madame Delacroix stepped forward, her hands folding at her waist. Your Grace, I was not expecting. Whatever she wishes to examine, she will examine. He spoke without raising his voice, but the words carried the weight of a man who had never needed to repeat himself. If anyone has difficulty with that arrangement, I will take my account elsewhere, permanently. Silence filled the shop like floodwater. Sybil's smile remained fixed, but her eyes had gone flat. The blonde looked at her pearls. The brunette studied the carpet. The child tugged the man's hand. Uncle Marcus, can the pretty lady help me choose? Lydia looked down. The girl was perhaps 8, with dark hair and gray eyes that held a grief too large for her small face. She was staring at Lydia with an intensity that felt like recognition. Lydia's voice caught. She forced herself to meet the man's gaze. I am not employed here, sir, I cannot. Then you are free to assist my goddaughter, without obligation to the establishment. He inclined his head slightly. If you are willing. She should have refused. Every instinct screamed that accepting this man's intervention would bind her to a debt she could not repay. But the child's hand had reached out, small fingers wrapping around Lydia's wrist with startling trust, and the words died in her throat. What is your name? The girl asked. Lydia Colbourne. I'm Cecily. The child's grip tightened. Will you help me find something beautiful? Lydia looked at the man again. He was perhaps 34, tall, with the kind of face that revealed nothing, and the posture of someone who had learned to carry weight without appearing to bend. His eyes were dark and watchful. When she met them, she saw something flicker there, not pity, but a startled recognition that mirrored what she felt looking at the child. He was as uncomfortable in this room as she was. "Yes," Lydia said. "I will help you." Madame Delacroix cleared her throat. "Your Grace, if you would prefer the private fitting room, here will suffice." Cecily listened with an intensity that seemed impossible for a child, asking questions that revealed a mind both sharp and lonely. Behind them, Lydia could hear Sybil attempting conversation with the man, Marcus. The child had called him, and receiving responses so brief, they bordered on dismissal. Lydia stopped before a bolt of cream silk with a subtle floral weave. "This," Cecily touched it carefully. "It is not very bright." "No, but it is perfect." Lydia drew the fabric into the light. "See how the pattern only appears when the cloth moves. That is skill. Any weaver can make something loud. Only a master can make something this quiet speak." The child's eyes widened. "Like a secret. Exactly like a secret. I want this one." Cecily turned, her voice rising. "Uncle Marcus, we have found it." The man crossed the room in 4 strides. He looked at the fabric, then at Lydia. "You have excellent taste, Miss Colbourne. It was Cecily's choice, guided by your instruction." He gestured to Madame Delacroix. "We will take sufficient yardage for a dress. Miss Colbourne will provide the measurements." Lydia stood quickly. "Sir, I cannot, you can." His gaze held hers. "Cecily has chosen you. I have learned not to argue with her instincts." The fitting took 20 minutes. Lydia worked with the efficiency of long practice, her hands steady as she measured Cecily's shoulders, waist, and hem length. The child stood perfectly still, watching Lydia's face with an expression that made her want to weep. When had anyone last looked at this girl and truly seen her? When the measurements were complete, Madame Delacroix wrapped the fabric in brown paper and tied it with string. Marcus produced a card and handed it to Lydia. "The dress should be delivered to this address when complete. You will be paid for your work." "I am not." Lydia stopped. The card bore an engraved crest and a single line, "Thornbury Park." She looked up sharply. "You are the Duke of Thornbury." "I am Marcus Ashworth." He took the wrapped fabric from Madame Delacroix. "The title is incidental." Cecily hugged Lydia suddenly, her thin arms fierce around Lydia's waist. "Thank you for helping me." Lydia's hand moved to the child's hair before she could stop herself. "You are very welcome." Marcus gently disentangled his goddaughter and guided her toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. His gaze found the bolt of midnight silk still gleaming on its stand. "Madame Delacroix," he said quietly, "I will take that bolt as well. Have it delivered to Miss Colbourne's address." Lydia's breath stopped. "Sir, I cannot accept. It is not a gift. It is payment in advance." His expression was unreadable. "I suspect we will have need of your services again." He left before she could protest, the door closing behind him, and Cecily with a sound like a sentence ending. Lydia stood in the center of the shop, her hands shaking, the card with its engraved crest burning against her palm. Behind her, Sybil's voice was ice-wrapped in silk. "How enterprising, Miss Colbourne. I had not realized seamstresses made house calls to dukes." Lydia turned slowly. Sybil was standing now, her companions flanking her like soldiers. The blonde's expression was avid. The brunette looked faintly sick. "I did not seek his attention," Lydia said. "Of course not." Sybil smiled. "I am certain it was entirely accidental. Just as I am certain the Duke's interest is purely professional." The word hung in the air like poison. Lydia felt her face burn, but she forced herself to hold Sybil's gaze. "Think what you like, Lady Vane. I know what I am." "Do you?" Sybil stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Because from where I stand, you are a tradesman's daughter, playing at being seen. The Duke may indulge his goddaughter's whims, but do not mistake charity for regard. Men like Marcus Ashworth do not see women like you. They use you, and forget you before the ink dries on the payment." Lydia's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "If you will excuse me, Lady Vane, I have work to attend to." She walked past Sybil and out into the rain, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The card was still clutched in her hand. She did not look at it again until she reached her rented room above the chandler's shop, 3 streets away. That evening, as the rain finally stopped and the sky turned the color of bruises, a parcel arrived. Lydia opened it with shaking hands. Inside was the midnight silk, folded with the precision of someone who understood fabric. There was no note, no explanation. Just the cloth her father had loved, delivered without ceremony to the daughter no one remembered. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the silk pooled across her lap, and for the first time in 7 years, she wept. 3 days later, Lydia stood at the servants' entrance of Thornbury Park. A wrapped package balanced on her hip. The house rose before her like a small country, all pale stone and endless windows. She had spent 2 nights completing Cecily's dress, her fingers working by candlelight until the seams were invisible and the hem fell in a perfect line. The work had been a relief. While she stitched, she did not have to think about the way the Duke had looked at her, or the way Sybil's words had burrowed under her skin like splinters. The door opened before she could knock. A housekeeper with silver hair and a face like carved wood regarded her with the neutral expression of someone practiced at sorting the worthy from the worthless. "Tradesman's entrance is around the side," the woman said. "I have a delivery for Miss Cecily." Lydia held up the package. "From Miss Colbourne." The housekeeper's expression shifted slightly. "You are the seamstress." "I am. Wait here." The door closed. Lydia stood in the morning cold, her breath misting, and tried not to feel like a beggar. 5 minutes passed. Then the door opened again, and a woman in a blue morning dress stepped out. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair and the same watchful eyes as the Duke. "Miss Colbourne." The woman's voice was warm. "I am Charlotte Ashworth, Marcus's sister. Cecily has spoken of nothing but you for 3 days. Please come inside." Lydia hesitated. "I only meant to deliver." "Nonsense." Charlotte took her arm with easy authority. "You will come in, you will see Cecily try on her dress, and you will take tea with us. I insist." She was led through corridors lined with portraits of women who had belonged here, their painted eyes following her progress. Charlotte kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking about the dress, the fabric, the time it had taken. Her questions were genuine, not the polite inquiries of someone filling silence. By the time they reached the nursery wing, Lydia's shoulders had begun to relax. Cecily was waiting in a room full of light. When she saw Lydia, her face transformed. "You came. I promised you something beautiful." Lydia knelt and unwrapped the package. "I hope I have kept my word." The dress was cream silk with a high waist and tiny pearl buttons. The floral weave caught the light as Lydia shook it out, the pattern appearing and disappearing like breath. Cecily touched it with reverent fingers. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Charlotte helped the child into the dress, while Lydia made minor adjustments, pinning the shoulders and checking the hem. The fit was perfect. Cecily turned in front of the mirror, watching the fabric move, and Lydia saw the moment. The child recognized herself as someone worth dressing beautifully. "Miss Colbourne," Charlotte said quietly, "this is extraordinary work." "Thank you. I am not flattering you. I am stating a fact." Charlotte studied her. "Where did you learn?" "My father was a draper. I grew up in his shop." "Was? He died 7 years ago." Charlotte's expression softened. "I am sorry. Losing a parent is—" She stopped, glancing at Cecily, who was still absorbed in her reflection. "It leaves a mark." "Yes," Lydia said. "It does." A voice from the doorway made them both turn. "I thought I heard familiar voices." Marcus stood at the threshold, still in riding clothes, his hair slightly disordered. His gaze went to Cecily first, and something in his face gentled. Then he looked at Lydia, and the gentleness became something else, something she could not name. "Uncle Marcus, look." Cecily spun, the dress flaring. "Am I not beautiful?" "You are." His voice was rough. "Miss Colbourne has worked a miracle." "It was hardly that," Lydia said. "The child and the fabric did most of the work. You are too modest." He stepped into the room, his presence filling it. "Charlotte, have we offered Miss Colbourne tea?" I was about to insist. Charlotte rang for a servant. "Miss Colbourne, you will join us in the morning room." It was not a question. Lydia found herself swept into a room with tall windows overlooking a garden, seated in a chair too fine for her plain dress, accepting tea from a footman who did not meet her eyes. Charlotte asked about her work, her lodgings, her prospects. Marcus said little, but she felt his attention like a hand at her back. When the tea was finished and Lydia rose to leave, Charlotte touched her arm. I have 3 dresses that require altering. Would you be willing to take the commission? Lydia's throat tightened. Of course. Excellent. I will have them sent to your address. Charlotte smiled. And I suspect Cecily will require additional dresses as the season progresses. You have made quite an impression. Lydia left Thornbury with a list of commissions and a strange lightness in her chest. She told herself it was relief at the prospect of steady work. She did not examine the way her heart had lifted when Marcus looked at her, or the way his voice had roughened when he called her work a miracle. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, with the midnight silk folded in her trunk, she allowed herself to remember the way he had stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression that looked almost like hunger. The commissions became visits. Charlotte's dresses led to requests from her friends, and soon Lydia was at Thornbury twice a week, her arms full of fabric and her mind full of measurements. She told herself she came for the work, but the truth was more complicated. Cecily clung to her. The child appeared whenever Lydia arrived, abandoning lessons or play to sit in whatever room Lydia occupied, watching her work with silent intensity. At first, Lydia tried to maintain professional distance, but Cecily's need was too raw, too familiar. She had been this child once, hungry for attention from someone who saw her as more than an obligation. So she let Cecily stay. She taught her to thread needles and recognize quality stitching. She answered questions about her father's shop, about fabrics and trade routes, and the way silk changed color in candlelight. And slowly, carefully, she asked questions in return. That was how she learned about. And Cecily's mother, a kind woman who had loved gardens and music, and had died when Cecily was 6. That was how she learned about Captain Hale, Cecily's father, who had been Marcus's closest friend, and had died at Waterloo 3 years ago. And that was how she learned that Cecily's grief was a living thing, fed by silence and the careful distance of adults, who did not know how to speak of loss. Marcus's visits to the workroom grew longer. He would appear in the doorway, ostensibly checking on Cecily, and then linger, asking about the fabric Lydia was cutting, or the technique she was using. His questions were intelligent, revealing a mind that understood systems and structures, even when applied to unfamiliar subjects. She found herself explaining thread counts and weaving patterns with the same pleasure she had felt teaching her father's apprentices. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the windows and Cecily napped on the settee, Marcus asked how she judged quality by touch. Lydia set down her shears. Close your eyes. He obeyed without hesitation. She took his hand, his fingers were long, calloused at the base from riding, and placed it against a square of linen. Feel the weave. Each thread crosses at a right angle. The spacing is even. Now this, she moved his hand to a square of cheaper cloth. The threads are irregular. The weave is loose. Can you feel the difference? Yes. His eyes were still closed. The first is tighter, more controlled. Exactly. She kept her hand over his, guiding his fingers across the samples. Quality is not about expense. It is about care. Every decision the weaver makes is recorded in the cloth. When the lesson ended, he did not open his eyes immediately. She did not withdraw her hand. They sat in silence, rain filling the space between them, and Lydia felt something shift in her chest like a door opening. That evening, as she prepared to leave, the rain intensified. Marcus appeared in the entrance hall as she pulled on her cloak. You cannot walk in this, he said. I have walked in worse. Nevertheless, he moved to the doorway and opened it. Rain lashed the threshold, turning the drive to a river. He stepped to the side and extended one arm against the doorframe, his body angled to create a sheltered corridor between stone and flesh. Please. She stared at the space he had made, close enough that she would pass within inches of him, sheltered by his height and the breadth of his shoulders. It was an act of such casual intimacy that her breath caught. Your Grace, Marcus. His voice was low. When we are alone, I am Marcus. She stepped into the space he had created, the rain loud on all sides, but not touching her. She could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of wool and rain-damp skin. She paused, her face turned up toward his, close enough to see the pulse beating at his throat. Neither of them spoke. The rain roared. Then she stepped through, out into the storm, and did not look back. but she felt his gaze on her, all the way down the drive. Lydia did not notice the commissions drying up at first. A cancellation here, a polite refusal there. She attributed it to the usual fluctuations of trade. But by the third week, the pattern was undeniable. 3 gentry wives who had requested fittings sent notes withdrawing their interest. A marchioness who had promised work for her daughter's debut sent her regrets. No explanations, no reasons given. She sat in her workroom with the cancelled notes spread before her and tried to understand. Her work had not declined. If anything, the pieces she had completed for Charlotte and her circle were the finest she had ever produced. But something had changed. Some invisible door had closed. It was her landlady, Mrs. Hewitt, who finally told her the truth. The woman appeared at her door one evening with bread and a grim expression. "There is talk, Miss Colbourne." Lydia set down her needle. "What kind of talk?" "About your visits to Thornbury Park. About the hours you keep there." Mrs. Hewitt's face was kind but firm. "I do not credit it, mind you, but others do. And Lady Vane has been most generous in spreading the story." The name hit like a fist. "What story?" "That you are trading more than fabric with the Duke." Mrs. Hewitt's voice dropped. "That your commissions are payment for services rendered in private." Lydia's vision narrowed. She gripped the edge of the table. "That is a lie. I know it. But lies spread faster than truth, particularly when they are delivered by a woman of Lady Vane's standing." Mrs. Hewitt touched her shoulder. "Be careful, child. The Duke's protection may be a cage as much as a shield." When the woman left, Lydia sat in the gathering dark and felt the walls closing in. She had been careful. She had maintained every boundary, refused every gift beyond payment for work. But it had not mattered. Sybil had found a weapon, and she was wielding it with precision. The next morning, a note arrived on cream stationery. Lydia recognized the handwriting before she broke the seal. "Miss Colbourne, I find myself in need of your particular expertise. Please call at your earliest convenience." S. Vane. Lydia nearly burned it. But curiosity and a cold, rising anger drove her to Sybil's townhouse that afternoon. She was shown into a drawing room that smelled of hothouse roses and expensive perfume. Sybil sat near the window, a book open in her lap, the picture of casual elegance. "Miss Colbourne, how kind of you to come." Sybil set the book aside. "Please sit." "I prefer to stand, as you wish." Sybil's smile was sharp. "I will be brief. I am prepared to offer you a commission. A ball gown for the midsummer celebration at Thornbury. The Duke is hosting, as I am sure you know. I wish to make an impression." Lydia's hands clenched at her sides. "Why would you commission work from a woman you have slandered across London?" "Slandered?" Sybil's eyebrows rose. "I have merely observed what others have noticed. Your frequent presence at Thornbury, the Duke's unusual interest, the child's attachment." She paused. "And the rather convenient timing of your commissions. I have done nothing improper. I believe you." Sybil's voice was silk over steel. "But belief is irrelevant. Perception is everything. And the perception, Miss Colbourne, is that you are using your position to secure the Duke's favor. Whether through skill or other means is a matter of speculation. Then why offer me work? Because I am not cruel." Sybil rose, crossing to the window. "I am practical. You are talented. I require a gown, and I wish to offer you a piece of advice, woman to woman. I do not want your advice. Nevertheless, you will hear it." Sybil turned, her expression almost pitying. "The Duke is repaying a debt through you, Miss Colbourne. Surely you see that." Lydia went cold. "What debt? Has he not told you?" Sybil's smile widened. "How interesting. Perhaps you should ask him about your father, about Captain Hale's regiment, about the cloth that bankrupted Thomas Colbourne and saved 200 soldiers." She let the words settle like stones. "Marcus Ashworth is a man of honor. He pays his debts. You are simply the currency." Lydia's breath stopped. The room tilted. "You are lying." "Am I?" Sybil picked up a folder from the side table and held it out. "These are the bankruptcy records. Public information, if one knows where to look. Your father supplied Captain Hale's regiment at cost. The army delayed payment. Your father died ruined. And Marcus's best friend, Cecily's father, survived that winter wearing cloth your father could not afford to sell." She set the folder down. "Every kindness he has shown you, every commission, every moment of attention. It is obligation, Miss Colbourne. He is settling his friend's account through you. Lydia stared at the folder. Her hands were shaking. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand your position. Sybil's voice softened, almost kind. You are not his equal. You are not even his choice. You are a debt to be cleared. And the sooner you accept that, the less it will hurt when he moves on. Lydia turned and walked out. She did not take the folder. She did not need to. The truth was already burning through her like acid, rewriting every moment, every look, every word Marcus had spoken. Had he known? When he defended her in the shop, when he sent the silk, when he stood in the rain and called her by her name. Had he known? She made it 3 streets before she had to stop, pressing her hand against a wall, her breath coming in gasps. Mrs. Hewitt's words echoed in her mind. The Duke's protection may be a cage as much as a shield. She had spent her life being useful to people who never saw her. She would not be a debt, not even his. That evening, Marcus came to her workroom. He did not knock. He simply appeared in the doorway as the last light faded from the sky, his expression unreadable. You have been avoiding me, he said. Lydia did not look up from the hem she was stitching. I have been working. Charlotte says you refused her latest commission. I am occupied with other projects. He crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched beside her chair, forcing her to meet his eyes. What has happened? She set down her needle carefully. Did you know? About my father and Captain Hale? The pause that followed told her everything. His face shifted, not guilt, but the recognition of discovery. He sat back on his heels. Yes, he said quietly. I learned it 3 weeks ago. Her chest tightened. Before or after you kissed me. Before. The word was a knife. She stood, putting distance between them. Then every kind thing you have done. The silk, the commission, Cecily. Was it Marcus, or was it the Duke of Thornbury, settling his friend's account? He rose slowly, his face pale. It was not like that. Then what was it like? Her voice broke. Because from where I stand, I am a debt. A line item in your ledger of obligations. My father saved your friend's life, and you repaid him by rescuing his daughter from poverty. How noble, how perfectly honorable. Lydia, do not call me that. She wrapped her arms around herself, her nails digging into her sleeves. I have spent my life being useful to people who never saw me. I was my father's assistant, the creditor's problem, the seamstress who should know her place. I will not be your debt, not even yours. He took a step toward her, his hands rising as though to touch her, then falling. You are not a debt. Then what am I? The question hung between them. He opened his mouth, closed it. She saw the struggle in his face, the man warring with the title, the truth fighting the performance. And she saw the moment he could not answer. That is what I thought, she said. Her voice was steady now, cold. Please leave. Lydia, if you would let me explain. There is nothing to explain. You knew. You have known for weeks. Every moment since then has been a lie. She turned her back on him. I will complete the work I have already accepted. After that, I will no longer require your patronage or your charity. She heard him breathing behind her, heard the floor creak as he shifted his weight. When he spoke, his voice was raw. I did not bring you into my life to clear a debt. I brought you in because you are the first person in 10 years who has looked at me and seen a man instead of a title. And yet, you could not tell me the truth. I was afraid. The admission seemed to cost him. Afraid that telling you would make it true. That everything I feel would be reduced to obligation. She closed her eyes. What you feel does not matter if I cannot trust it. The quiet that followed stretched like a wound. Then she heard his footsteps, slow and heavy, crossing the room. The door opened, closed. She stood alone in the candlelight, surrounded by fabric and thread, and felt the last fragile thing inside her break. Marcus sat in Lydia's empty chair, the workroom dark around him, and understood that Sybil had found the one weapon that could work. Not scandal, not ruin, doubt. He had spent his life performing the role others required. The perfect heir, the dutiful Duke. The man who never faltered, never failed, never allowed himself the luxury of wanting something for himself. And when he had finally found someone who made him want to stop performing, he had destroyed it by maintaining the very lie that defined his existence. He had known about Thomas Colbourne's sacrifice for 3 weeks. He had discovered it in estate records, while researching military contracts for a charity board. The name had stopped him cold. Colbourne, draper, Supplied Captain Hale's regiment at cost. Bankrupted by delayed military payment. Died 6 months after the business collapsed. The man whose daughter he had defended in a shop was the man whose sacrifice had kept his best friend alive long enough to father Cecily. He had not told Lydia because he had not known how to untangle what he owed from what he wanted. And now she believed the worst, that every moment between them had been performance, obligation dressed as affection. The only way to prove otherwise was an act so public and costly that no one could interpret it as quiet settlement. An act that would expose him completely, strip away every careful wall he had built, and force him to become the man he had only pretended to be. He would give her the truth, all of it, in front of everyone who mattered. He would give her the midsummer ball. The invitations went out a week later. The midsummer ball at Thornbury Park, hosted by His Grace the Duke of Thornbury. 300 guests, orchestra, supper, dancing until dawn. London society received the news with the avidity of sharks scenting blood. The Duke never hosted balls. He attended them with perfect courtesy and left early. For him to open Thornbury for a celebration of this scale meant something had shifted. Speculation ran wild. Lydia received her invitation by hand delivery. She opened it in her workroom, read it twice, and set it aside. She would not go. She had promised herself she would not see him again, would not allow herself to be drawn back into the orbit of his guilt and her own foolish hope. But the midnight silk sat in her trunk like an accusation. The fabric he had sent her, the fabric her father had loved, the last remnant of a world that had erased her family without ceremony. If she made a gown from it, if she wore her father's fabric, cut and stitched by her own hands, to the Duke's ball, it would be an act of defiance. Not for Marcus, for herself. She began cutting that night. The gown took shape over 2 weeks. She worked in silence, her hands steady, her mind deliberately blank. The silk fell in clean lines from a high waist. The bodice fitted close, the sleeves long and simple. She stitched the hem by hand, each stitch invisible, each decision a rejection of the idea that her skill required validation from anyone but herself. On the night of the ball, she dressed in the room above the chandler's shop, pinning her hair with the same precision she applied to seams. The gown fit perfectly. The midnight silk caught the candlelight and turned it to liquid shadow. She looked like her father's daughter. She looked like someone who belonged. She arrived at Thornbury as the sun set, the house blazing with light. Carriages lined the drive. Music spilled from the open doors. She walked past the receiving line without announcing herself and entered the ballroom alone. 300 faces turned toward her. She felt the weight of their attention like hands pressing against her skin. Conversations died. Women leaned toward each other, whispering. Men stared. And at the far end of the room, standing beside a marble column, Marcus went utterly still. Sybil appeared at her elbow within seconds, her smile sharp as a blade. Miss Colbourne, how unexpected. Lydia met her gaze. I was invited. Of course you were. Sybil's voice carried, designed to be overheard. Though I confess I am surprised you chose to attend, given the circumstances. What circumstances? Sybil produced a folded paper from her reticule and handed it to her. I thought you should see this before the evening progresses. For your own dignity. Lydia unfolded the paper. It was a printed handbill, cheaply made, distributed like a broadsheet. The heading read, A Cautionary Tale of Ambition and Pretense. Below it, in careful detail, was the history of Thomas Colbourne's bankruptcy, the failed military contract, the creditors, the death 6 months later, and at the bottom in bold type, his daughter, Miss Lydia Colbourne, a seamstress of no family, no fortune, and no claim beyond the obvious, has lately been seen frequenting the residence of His Grace, the Duke of Thornbury. The implication was poison. The entire room would read it as confirmation of every rumor Sybil had spread. Lydia's hands shook. She forced them still. You did this. I merely provided facts. Sybil's smile widened. What people choose to believe is beyond my control. You are destroying me for sport. I am protecting what is mine. Sybil's voice dropped, vicious now. Marcus Ashworth will not marry a tradesman's daughter. He will not sully his name for a woman whose father died of failure. And if you had any sense, you would leave now before this becomes more humiliating than it already is. Lydia looked at the handbill again, at her father's name printed like evidence of shame, and something inside her, something that had bent and bent and bent, finally hardened into steel. "No," she said quietly. "I will not leave." She walked past Sybil and into the center of the ballroom, the handbill still clutched in her hand. Around her, conversations resumed, the whispers spreading like fire. She heard her name, heard seamstress, heard no family, heard obvious, and then a voice cut through the noise, clear and carrying. "I know this cloth." Lydia turned. An older man in military dress was rising from his seat near the dance floor, his eyes fixed on her gown. He crossed the room slowly, his gaze locked on the fabric. When he reached her, he extended a hand toward the hem of her sleeve. "May I?" She nodded mute. He touched the silk, his fingers tracing the edge where the selvage was visible. His face transformed. "This is Colbourne cloth." His voice was rough. "I wore this at Alsfeld. I know the weave. I know the mark." He turned to the room, his voice rising. "This woman is wearing fabric woven by Thomas Colbourne, the draper who supplied my regiment, at half the price, because the army could not pay. 216 men survived that winter wearing his cloth. I was one of them." The room went silent. The man, Colonel Whitmore, she realized, the quartermaster Charlotte had mentioned, looked at her with an expression close to reverence. "Your father saved my life, Miss Colbourne, and the lives of every man in my regiment. We did not forget. We wrote letters to the army, demanding payment, but it came too late." His voice broke. "I am sorry. We should have done more." Lydia could not speak. The handbill slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. Around her, the murmur began again, but the tone had changed. People were looking at her gown with new eyes, seeing not pretension but legacy, seeing not a seamstress, but a daughter. And then Marcus moved. He crossed the ballroom in long strides, every eye following him. He stopped before Lydia, his face pale, his eyes blazing. "Thomas Colbourne," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "saved the life of the man who gave me the child I love most in this world. Captain Hale survived Waterloo long enough to father his daughter, because your father bankrupted himself to clothe soldiers the army had abandoned." He paused, his gaze locked on hers. "His daughter stands before you wearing a gown she cut and stitched herself, because the skill her father taught her did not die when this society erased his name." He extended his hand. "I did not bring you here to repay a debt. I brought you here because you are the finest person in this room, and I am done pretending I do not know it." Lydia stared at his hand. The entire ballroom was watching. Sybil's face was white. Colonel Whitmore was nodding, and Marcus was looking at her with an expression that held no calculation, no performance, nothing but raw, desperate honesty. "I am not a debt to be settled, Your Grace," she said, her voice shaking. No, he stepped closer, his hand still extended. "You are a choice, the first real one I have ever made." She looked at his hand, at his face, at the room full of people who had spent years deciding she did not matter. And she took his hand. The orchestra began. He led her onto the floor. And as they danced, the room watching, she felt the weight of her father's name settle back onto her shoulders, not as shame, but as armor. When the dance ended, Marcus did not release her hand. He led her out onto the terrace, away from the lights and the eyes, into the summer dark. They stood at the top of the steps, the music distant now, the garden below them soft with shadow. "I should have told you," he said. "The moment I learned about your father, I should have trusted you with the truth." "Yes," she said, "you should have. I was afraid that telling you would reduce what I feel to obligation, that you would believe I wanted you because I owed you." He turned to face her. "But the truth is, I wanted you before I knew. I wanted you the moment you looked at me in that shop and saw past the title. I wanted you when you taught Cecily to see beauty in quiet things. I wanted you when you walked into a storm to find a child who was not yours." His voice dropped. "I wanted you, not your father's legacy, not Hale's memory. You." She felt tears on her face, hot and sudden. "How can I believe that? Because I am standing here in front of 300 people, telling them that you are the finest person I know. Because I am establishing a fund in your father's name to support craftsmen ruined by military contracts. Because I am asking you, in front of God and society, to choose me not as a duke, but as a man who has spent his entire life performing and wants to stop." He took her other hand. I am asking you to let me be real. With you. Only you. She looked at their joined hands, at his face stripped of every careful mask, at the garden below, dark and waiting. I do not need you to save me, she said. I know. I do not need Thornbury or titles or society's approval. I know. I need you to see me. Not my father's sacrifice. Not the debt you think you owe. Me. I see you. His voice was raw. I have seen you from the first moment, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it if you let me. She kissed him, not gently, not with the careful restraint of someone performing for an audience. She kissed him the way she had wanted to, since the day he stood in the rain and made a shelter of his body. She kissed him until his hands came up to frame her face, until his breath was ragged, until the distant music and the waiting ballroom and the weight of her father's name all fell away. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. Is that a yes? He whispered. It is a beginning, she said. 6 months later, Lydia sat in the workroom Marcus had built for her at Thornbury. It was not in the Duchess's apartments. She had refused those, and he had not argued. Instead, he had converted the old conservatory into a space of light and function. Cutting tables ran the length of the room. Bolts of fabric lined the walls. The windows faced south, flooding the space with sun. Cecily sat cross-legged on the floor, threading a needle with the fierce concentration of a child, determined to master a skill. She had asked to learn, and Lydia had agreed on the condition that she take it seriously. The girl had not missed a lesson in 4 months. Like this? Cecily held up the threaded needle. Perfect. Lydia smiled. Now show me a running stitch. The door opened quietly. Marcus appeared with a tea tray, his cravat slightly askew, his expression soft in a way it never was in public. He set the tray on the side table and crossed to where Lydia sat, bending to press a kiss to the top of her head. How is the lesson progressing? Cecily is a natural. Lydia looked up at him. She has her mother's patience. Something flickered in his eyes, grief, yes, but also gratitude, and would have liked you. I wish I could have known her. She would have been glad I found you. He touched her cheek, or that you found me. Cecily looked up from her stitching. Are you going to be mushy again? Because I am trying to concentrate. Lydia laughed. My apologies, darling. We will be appropriately serious. Marcus moved to the window, looking out over the garden. Lydia watched him. This man who had spent his life performing and had finally learned to stop. They had married quietly in the parish church with only Charlotte and Cecily and Colonel Whitmore in attendance. Society had been shocked. Sybil had left London, and Marcus had smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in a decade. The Colbourne Fund had distributed its first grants the previous month. 17 craftsmen, whose businesses had collapsed under military contracts, received payment and public recognition. Lydia's father's name was engraved on the fund's charter, his sacrifice recorded permanently. Madame Delacroix had written requesting Lydia's designs for her next collection. Lydia had replied with her terms. Her name on the work, her prices non-negotiable, her time her own. Madame Delacroix had agreed. Lydia returned her attention to Cecily's stitching, correcting the girl's grip on the needle. Outside, the garden was green and quiet. Inside, the workroom smelled of tea and fabric and sun-warmed wood. Marcus turned from the window and met her gaze. No words, just the look of a man who had finally come home. And Lydia, who had spent her life being invisible, looked back at the man who saw her and knew that she had chosen well.